What is up, gamers? It's Turkey here, and today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. Today we're going to be ranking every single card evolution inside of Clash Royale from lowest tier to highest tier using the system setup in front of your screen. Just in case you're unfamiliar with how tiers work, there's an S tier on the top, an F tier on the bottom, A, B, and C tiers right smack dab in the middle. Most of the way that this works is self-explanatory, but I want to set up a few ground rules before we get into it. First, and most importantly, everything that I say today is my opinion. And what that means is my opinion does not equal facts. And you, as the viewer, are entitled to your own opinion. And it's kind of weird that I need to say this, but just because your opinion is different from my opinion, there's no need to comment on the video with anything hateful or mean or derogatory or anything like that. But what I do invite you to do is to share your opinion. I want to hear your opinions. I'm so excited to see comments on the video, challenging the assertions that I make in this video and just sharing your voice. All that I ask is that you please do so respectfully. Okay, now that that's out of the way, I want to establish two important points of rating criteria. Point number one is that all of the ratings today are for the evolved form of the card only and no consideration for the regular form of the card. And criteria number two, the ratings for these evolutions are how they perform inside top ladder. So how these cards perform at mid ladder is not really to be considered today. Now that this soft criteria has been established, let's get into the rankings. Starting us strong at the F tier, the worst evolution inside of Clash Royale, Evolved Barbarians. It feels like this has been the worst evolution in the game for a while now. I definitely think that it needs a buff. You pretty much only see it inside of Lava Hound decks, and even then, it would be way better if you just played guards instead of using these Evolved Barbarians for your elixir needs. So there's really no need for this card. It's so far out of the meta, and I would be in favor of a small buff for this card. My next and final card going in the F tier is the Evolved Ice Spirit. I feel like my main gripe for this card is that it doesn't really pack the punch that you expect from an evolution slot. If I'm going to use an evolution slot on one of the cards, I don't want to use it on Evil Ice Spirit. It provides very little value for me and my deck most of the time. And a lot of you are going to say, well, it's only a one elixir card. How good could it be? Well, look at Evil Skeletons. Those are only a one elixir card, and spoiler alert, they're one of the best evolutions in the game. While I understand that it provides some really good value inside of quick cycle decks, it's really only because there's no better evolution to put in cycle decks. Trust me, as soon as a Hog Evo comes out or an Earthquake Evo comes out, you're not going to be using Evil Ice Spirit. So I would be in favor for a small buff to this card. Okay, moving up a tier, up to the C tier, arguable rework needed is the Evolved Battle Ram. After the nerf it received a few seasons ago, this card has really fallen out of the meta. In general, it's just not a really strong supporting card. Most people are running buildings and it's relatively easy to counter. And on top of that, it spawns two Evolved Barbarians, which we just talked about as being one of the weaker evolved cards. Like I mentioned, if Evolved Barbarians as a whole get improved, get a small buff, maybe we'll see this card come back into the meta. The next card that I have in this C tier is the Evolved Wall Breakers, definitely in my bottom 5 of evolution. Similar to the same, concept with the Battle Ram. So many people are running buildings. You don't get that much extra value from the Evolved version of the Wall Breakers. They're not that difficult to counter. Really, you're just hoping that your opponent doesn't run a building. Otherwise, this card is just a waste of an evolution slot. Next card going into this tier, the C tier, is the Evolved Archers. This evolution at one point in time I would have put in A tier, but it received a small nerf not that long ago, and now it's just not that strong. The whole point of having an evolution in your deck is to always force out a positive elixir trade on defense. But ever since it was made that Evolved Archers die to arrows, they're really just not that strong of a card. 3-for-3 trade for an evolution slot is not ideal. The only reason this card isn't in the F tier is because you have the ability to split them, so they don't always get great arrows value, but in general, they are for sure one of the weaker evolutions in the game. And kind of piggybacking off of that concept, evolutions that are weak to spells, Evolved Firecracker also goes in this tier for me. I mean, same idea here. The fact that it dies to arrows, while I think is somewhat balanced, has just weakened it as a whole. I don't think it's an F tier card. I don't think it needs a buff to its health, but net, it's just a fairly evolution to counter. On top of that, you usually just see it like inside of Hog Rider decks, maybe like Royal Giant decks or like minor Tornado off meta decks. So it's just not that versatile of a card. And of course, the whole King Tower activation team just makes it not that strong. King Tower activation thing is what I was trying to say. And my final card that is going in this C tier evolution list is the Evolved Bats. This is a similar concept to the two evolutions that I just talked about. It's really not that spell proof. It survives like an E-Spirit and an Ice-Spirit and a Zap, but the larger spells, arrows take care of it, and any of the troops that one-shot it, in its non-evolved form will one-shot it in its evolution formed as well. So really, I feel like a bulk of their value comes on defense, but like I said, any good player, any top 1000 player is gonna know you have bats, and they're gonna think of an easy way to counter it with spells. So net, I feel like Evo bats don't pack the punch that you expect from an evolved card. Alright, every card from this point on is going to be B tier or above, meaning that the evolution I would consider is very strong. And B tier specifically I have as my ideal tier, and this is where most of the card evolutions are going to fall. First card in this list is the Evolved Royal Giant. When I think of card evolutions and I think of balanced card evolutions, the Evo RG is like always the first one that comes to mind. It's strong, it's intimidating, I really need to think about it and strategize and plan around it from a defensive point of view, but it's not broken. It provides so much value for you on offense, and it is 100% using in your deck if you are running Royal Giant. Next in this tier list is going to be the Evolved Zap. This card recently got a rework in the most recent set of balance changes, but it's still a really strong card. Not as strong as it once was, but it is still a very versatile evolution. We can see it inside of P.E.K.K.A decks, Mega Knight decks, Golem decks, Lava Hound decks, all of those beatdown decks. It is very worthwhile having this card. But I would say that this card is very balanced and not as broken as it used to be. Next card on this tier list is going to be the Evolved Tesla. Pre-balance changes, I was going to have this in my S tier. I think it used to be one of the strongest evolutions in the game, but with the removal of the Death Shockwave, this card is nowhere near as strong as it used to be. And as I mentioned, we're only taking into consider the evolved version of card, not the normal version of the card. And the normal version of the card did get a health buff. So the normal Tesla is stronger, but the evolved Tesla is a lot weaker, and that's why it drops to the B tier for me. Next in this tier is going to be the Evolved Royal Recruits. I kind of have these in my mind similar to how I described Royal Giant. It's just like a strong evolution, an evolution that's good. When it drops down on the map, you're like, evil Royal Recruits, but you're not like, oh, I just lost. They're a really strong evolution, but they're not overpowered. They're relatively easy to counter, and they're a super predictable card. I feel like at like mid-ladder, this would be tiered a lot higher, but like I said, inside the top 10,000, it's not too difficult to defend Royal Recruits. Next on this tier list is going to be the Evo Mortar. This card is a little bit of a fringe card. I think it could maybe sneak up into the A tier, but it got a smallest nerf on the first hit recently, and so I'm gonna have to put it in the B tier. But I think this card is incredibly strong, one of the best win conditions in the game, with or without the evolution form. And if you can just get one Evo Mortar lock onto your opponent's tower, most of the time it's just an instant GG's. And like I've said, very thematic for this tier, strong but not broken. Next card at this level is going to be the Evolved Goblin Cage. This evolution was a little underwhelming for me. I think the main thing holding this card back is its lack of versatility. I think if this evolution got more value against more win conditions, we would absolutely see it in the A tier, but it's really only good against beatdown decks. So, if you're playing against P.E.K.K.A or Golem, you're celebrating, you're throwing your hands in the air. But if you're not playing against any of those win conditions, this evolution does very little for you. So if you're someone who hates playing against beatdown, good for you, put this card in your deck. But because of the lack of versatility, this is going to stay in the B tier for me. Next card on this list is going to be the Evo Wizard. It recently got a nerf, a much needed nerf. It was way too strong on the pushback from the shield popping, and I think this card is perfect. It is still a very menacing card. That force field concept is still there. They didn't rework that. They left that thing in, but they made it a lot more fair and easier to defend. I have very few changes or criticisms for this card. In my eyes, this is the ideal strength of evolution. Next in this tier, and I think a lot of people might disagree with me, is the Evolved Goblin Barrel. I know when this card first came out, people were like, oh, this card is trash, it's not that good. But people are starting to realize that this card is actually really strong, especially with Cannoneer being really prevalent in the meta. This card gets so much value. We see Hypno CR dominating with this deck. My personal deck, my favorite deck, also uses this win condition, and I think it's actually really strong. Again, it's one of those evolutions that always forces out a large positive elixir trade on defense. But at the same time, people that are really good at defending and are able to predict it can kind of defend it very strong. I've noticed that when I'm inside the top 1000, people have no issue defending this card, which is what makes it very balanced and why it falls in the B tier. And my last and final card in this tier, and I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me, is the Evolved Electro Dragon. Because this card got nerfed pre-release, it honestly dropped it down from an S tier all the way down to B tier, in my opinion. I thought for sure that this card was going to be broken, but in reality, it's not that strong. It's very predictable, and if you know that it's coming, you know they have it in cycle, you really just space out your troops, plan around the tornado, and it's not that difficult to defend. To be fair, I think most of its strength comes on the defensive side of things, so if you're someone who runs a deck like a beatdown deck, I guess it is very strong defensively, but offensively, it's really not that big of a threat. And in general, cards that are elite on defense, like the Tesla or the Goblin Cage, just tend to fall in the B tier in my opinion. And that is going to conclude the B tier, the ideal tier for me. Let's talk about the A tier. First card in the A tier for me is going to be the Evolved Goblin Drill. Following the rework, this card dropped from the S tier to the A tier for me. It is really strong, it's still really difficult to defend, but without the spawn damage, it's not as broken as it once was. I think you could argue this card to be in the B tier as well, but I think it falls into the A tier because it is so difficult to defend, and in double and triple elixir, when your opponent just cycles drill poisons on you, evolve drill poison, it is just so tough to defend. Next card in this tier list is going to be the Evolved Knight. I think the reason that this card falls into this tier, number one for me, is the versatility. This card not only fits into so many different decks, arguably the most or second most versatile evolution, it's strong on offense and it's strong on defense. The fact that Supercell has had to nerf this card like 3 different times goes to show how strong the concept of the evolution is. And until they completely rework the card concept, there's no way that this is going to fall below the B tier, but for me, it goes in the A tier. I think a lot of people are going to disagree with this next one, but I also have the Evil Valkyrie in this same tier. Kind of a similar idea to the Knight. Its versatility is really strong. It's strong on defense, not as strong on offense, but it fits into so many decks. I think the greatest aspect of this card for me has been the pulling force from the Valkyrie. The way that it attacks air troops, but also pulls troops into the middle of the field is so underrated. And Valkyrie has bailed me out on defense more than any other card in the game. I think it is arguably the best defensive card in the game, at least defensive evolution, not counting evil skeletons. So we're going to keep Mommy Valkyrie in the A tier. Next A tier evolution is going to be the Evolved Bomber. After the much needed ranged nerf that it received a couple seasons back, this card feels very balanced. Maybe not as balanced as it should be, but in my opinion, it doesn't quite warrant that S tier level rank. But like a lot of the other cards in this tier, it does have strong prowess on offense and defense. And man, for only 2 elixir, this card packs a punch, and it's so easy to cycle so many of these Evolved Bombers, but we are glad that it is a 3-cycle evolution now. But net, I think it's a very strong evolution, a top 5 Evo in my books. Next and final card on this tier list is going to be the Evolved Goblin Giant. I definitely feel like a lot of people sleep on this card. It's kind of sneaky good. Like, it dropped and it wasn't like, oh, this card's so broken. It was kind of underrated, but inside the top 1000, I think one of the most popular evolutions is this one in combination with like the Evo P.E.K.K.A. I think the concept of this card is really great, and it really forces your opponent to like have to think on defense. They need to have strong single unit DPS, but they also need to have a splash card down, otherwise they're going to get overwhelmed by the spawn of goblins. So to me, this is an A tier concept and just on the fringe of being a little too broken and sneaking into that S tier, but again, this is a top 5 evolution for me. And here we are, the S tier. If you've made it this far, just know how much I appreciate you watching me and supporting me, and by now you've probably found something that you disagreed with. So get your comments ready. I'm looking forward to reading all of the feedback in the comment section. Thank you so much. First S tier card, and I feel like this is unarguable, is the Evolved P.E.K.K.A. Even after the balance changes, this card is so incredibly strong. It is very difficult to defend. There are limited options that you can use to successfully defend the Evo P.E.K.K.A. Like really, your best option is just a building, because the fact that any ground troop heals this card up just makes it so conceptually hard to defend. It's like you have a card where the best counter for it is a swarm card, and they just take away that option entirely. It doesn't matter that it doesn't heal up as strong as it used to be. It is still one of the hardest cards to defend in the game. When that card gets dropped on the field, my heart sinks. I think this is unarguably a top 2 evolution in the game. Next in this tier is going to be the Evolved Mega Knight. I feel like this one is an arguable between the S tier and the A tier, but I found this card to be really, really useful on offense and defense, and it's just so difficult to play around. For some of the B tier cards, I talk about predictability, the way that it is easy to defend certain cards, like the Mortar or, the Evolved Royal Recruits or even the Royal Giant. The Mega Knight interactions are just really tricky, and it's really difficult to defend. Even for me as a top 1000 player, it is just hard. I didn't touch on this in the P.E.K.K.A, but similar to some of the other strong evolutions, the versatility that this card has is actually insane, considering it costs like 7 elixir. There's been so many times I'm playing on ladder and they're running a deck and I think they're running a completely different win condition, and then they hit me with the evolved Mega Knight and I'm like, oh my gosh, of course this works in your deck. So for the shocking amount of versatility, its strength on offense and defense, and its overall difficulty to defend, this is going to fit in the S tier for me. And now, in my opinion, unarguably the best evolution in the game, Evolved Skeletons. I mean, we knew it was coming. This one's tricky because it is so hard when you have a card that only costs 1 elixir. You're either going to have an evolution that is completely broken and provides a ton of value, or is just kind of useless like the Evolved Ice Spirit. So I get it, it's tough. You're kind of handcuffed with the way that you're going to work around this card. But having a card that can counter an entire 8 elixir golem or 5 elixir giant, or I don't know, take an entire tower, just seems so incredibly broken. The only reason that I feel like Supercell has not completely reworked this card is because they die to any spell in the game. But like I mentioned, this card always forces out a massive positive elixir trade, and if left to its own devices, it does so much damage, more than any troop in the game in such a short amount of time. In addition to everything I've just said, they also are probably the most versatile evolution in the entire game. No matter what your deck archetype is, there is always room for Evo Skeletons. It is the most versatile evolution by far. If you don't know what to put in your deck, what Evo do I put? Just put Evo Skeletons in, like it's worth it. They are the most efficient and most strong evolution in the game. And I think that's everything I have to say. Big shout outs to everyone watching. This is the first time I've made one of these tier lists, so I'm kind of nervous to see some of your feedback back, but like I mentioned, I welcome it. Please be kind, be respectful. Let me know what you think about the current state of the game, evolutions, Goblinstein, all of that stuff. I love hearing your feedback. Thank you so much for watching. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate it. And I hope to see you in another video real soon. Peace.